To assess the concept of authority and determine its worth, we must begin by clearly defining what it means and what it is. From early childhood, we are taught to submit to the will of authority, to obey the edicts of those who, in one way or another, have acquired positions of power and control from the beginning. The goodness of a child is graded, whether explicitly or implicitly, first by how well he obeys his parents, then by how well he obeys his teachers, and then by how well he obeys the laws of government. Whether implied or stated, society is saturated with the message that obedience is a virtue, and that the good people are the ones who do what authority tells them to do. As a result of that message, the concepts of morality and obedience have become so muddled in most people's minds that any attack on the notion of authority will, to most people, feel like an attack on morality itself. Any suggestion that government is inherently illegitimate will sound like suggesting that everyone should behave as uncaring, vicious animals living life by the code of survival of the fittest. The trouble is that the average person's belief system rests upon a hodgepodge of vague, often contradictory concepts and assumptions. Terms such as morality and obedience, laws and legislatures, leaders and citizens are used constantly by people who have never rationally examined such concepts. The first step in trying to understand the nature of authority or government is to define what the word means. What is this thing called government? Government tells people what to do, but that by itself does not give us a sufficient definition, because all sorts of individuals and organizations tell others what to do. Government, however, does not simply suggest or requests. It commands. But an advertiser who says, "Act now," or a preacher who tells his congregation what to do could also be said to be giving commands, but they are not government. Unlike the commands of preachers and advertisers, the commands of government are backed by the threat of punishment, the use of force against those who do not comply. Those who are caught breaking the law. But even that does not give us a complete definition, because street thugs and bullies also enforce their commands, but they are not government. The distinguishing feature of authority is that it is thought to have the right to give and enforce commands. In the case of government, its commands are called laws, and disobeying them is called crime. Authority can be summed up as the right to rule. It is not merely the ability to forcibly control others, which to some extent nearly everyone possesses. It is the supposed moral right to forcibly control others. What distinguishes a street gang from government is how they are perceived by the people they control, the trespasses, robbery, extortion, assault, and murder committed by common thugs are perceived by almost everyone as being immoral, unjustified, and criminal. Their victims may comply with their demands, but not out of any feeling of moral obligation to obey, merely out of fear. If the intended victims of the street gang thought they could resist without any danger to themselves, they would do so, without the slightest feeling of guilt. They do not perceive the street thug to be any sort of legitimate, rightful ruler. They do not imagine him to be authority. The loot the thugs collect is not referred to as taxes, and his threats are not called laws. The demands and commands of those who wear the label of government, on the other hand, are perceived very differently by most of those whom the commands are aimed. The power and control the lawmakers in government exert over everyone else is seen as valid and legitimate, legal and good. Likewise, most who comply with such commands by obeying the law, and who hand over their money by paying taxes, do not do so merely out of fear of punishment if they disobey, but also out of a feeling of duty to obey. No one takes pride in being robbed by a street gang, but many wear the label of law-abiding taxpayer as a badge of honor. This is due entirely to how the obedient perceive the ones giving them commands. If they are perceived as authority, a rightful master, then by definition, they are seen as having the moral right to give such commands, which in turn implies a moral obligation on the part of the people to obey those commands. To label oneself a law-abiding taxpayer is to brag about one's loyal obedience to government. In the past, some churches have claimed the right to punish heretics and other sinners, but in the Western world today, the concepts of authority is almost always linked to government. In fact, the two terms can now be used almost synonymously, since, in this day and age, each implies the other. Authority, supposedly derived from the laws enacted by government, and government is the organization imagined to have the right to rule, i.e., authority. It is essential to differentiate between a command being justified based upon the situation and being justified based upon who gave the command. Only the latter is the type of authority being addressed in this book, though the term is occasionally used in another sense, which tends to muddle this distinction. When, for example, someone asserts that he had the authority to stop a mugger to get an old lady's purse back, or said he had the authority to chase trespassers off his property, he is not claiming to possess any special rights that others do not possess. He is simply saying that he believes that certain situations justify giving orders or using force. In contrast, the concept of government is about certain people having some special right to rule. And in that idea, the notion that some people, as a result of elections or other political rituals, for example, have the moral right to control others in situations where most people would not, is the concept being addressed here. Only those in government are thought to have the right to enact laws. Only they are thought to have the right to impose taxes. Only they are thought to have the right to wage wars, to regulate certain matters, to grant licenses for various activities, and so on. When the belief in authority is discussed in this book, that is the meaning being referred to, the idea that some people have the moral right to forcibly control others, and that, consequently, those others have the moral obligation to obey. It should be stressed that authority is always in the eye of the beholder. If the one being controlled believes that the one controlling him has the right to do so, then the one being controlled sees the controller as authority. If the one being controlled does not perceive the control to be legitimate, then the controller is not viewed as authority, but is seen simply as a bully or a thug. The tentacles of the belief in authority reach into every aspect of human life, but the common denominator is always the perceived legitimacy of the control it exerts over others. Every law and tax, federal, state, or local, every election and campaign, every license and permit, every political debate and movement, in short, everything having to do with government, from a trivial town ordinance to a world war, rests entirely upon the idea that some people have acquired the moral right, in one way or another, to one degree or another, to rule over others. The issue here is not just the misuse of authority, or an argument about good government versus bad government, but an examination of the fundamental underlying concept of authority. Whether an authority is seen as absolute or as having conditions or limits upon it may have a bearing on how much damage that authority does, but it has no bearing on whether the underlying concept is rational. The U.S. Constitution, for example, is imagined to have created an authority which, at least in theory, had a severely restricted right to rule. Nonetheless, it still sought to create an authority with the right to do things like tax and regulate, which the average citizen has no right to do on his own. Though it pretended to give the right to rule only over certain specific matters, it still claimed to bestow some authority upon a ruling class, and as such is just as much a target of the following criticism of authority as the authority of a supreme dictator would be. The term authority is sometimes used in ways that have nothing to do with the topic of this book. For example, one who is an expert in some field is often referred to as an authority. Likewise, some relationships resemble authority, but do not involve any right to rule. The employer-employee relationship is often viewed as if there is a boss and an underling. However, no matter how domineering or overbearing an employer may be, he cannot conscript workers or imprison them for disobedience. The only power he really has is the power to terminate the arrangement by firing the employee, and the employee has the same power because he can quit. The same is true of other relationships that may resemble authority, such as a craftsman and his apprentice, a martial arts sensei and his pupil, a trainer and the athlete he trains. Such scenarios involve arrangements based upon mutual voluntary agreement in which both sides are free to opt out of the arrangement. Such a relationship, where one person allows another to direct his actions in the hopes that he will benefit from the other's knowledge or skills, is not the type of authority that constitutes the most dangerous superstition, if it constitutes authority at all. Voluntarist Academy. Please subscribe.